So now we'll turn to our first keynote speaker, Sacha Spector, who is Director of the Environment Program at the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. Sacha brings, in your packet, I won't spend a lot of words on it, but it brings a great background to this with his role as Director of Science at Scenic Hudson, one of the nation's premier land trusts. So, Sacha, welcome.
I left my coffee cup. Whew. Good morning. That's good. We can tell there's not a lot of Northeasterners in the room when we get a good response like that. Let me start out by expressing my appreciation for the network staff and the planning committee for bringing us together here and for creating such a rich agenda. It's really a remarkable room, and they've brought us together and crafted this really worthwhile endeavor. So let's give them a round of applause. So the topic I was asked to address today is innovations and ideas for the future of conservation. Perhaps one of the most important innovations, I think, is the network. It's creating a learning community in an emerging practice, which is needs fostering and nurturing. And so this convening is actually one of the key innovations. But I must admit, I'm a little bit humbled by the prospect of standing in front of this room. As others have said, this is the Fort Knox of landscape conservation experience. And so I think it's kind of a fool's errand to ask anyone to sort of point the way. So instead, what I'm going to try to do is tell you about a few things that I see from my perch in a glass tower on the 19th floor of a glass tower in Manhattan. Tell you about a few things that I find really exciting, or that give me a lot of optimism. But first, I want to start out this morning by returning us to what brings us here, which is home. This was my home. This was the view across the street from the house I grew up in. It's the Black Dirt region of Orange County in the Hudson Valley of New York. Last night's presentations were a really powerful reminder to me of that connection to place that drives all of what we do. And so let me tell you a little bit about this place. These are fields that were carved out of Pleistocene lake beds, full of mastodon bones that were dug up every time somebody put in a new sewer connection. And they were covered by white cedar forests, swamps that filled in afterward, that were cleared by the Dutch settlers. They were hunted heavily by the Lenapes, and then cleared by the Dutch settlers, and then taken over by the Italian immigrants in the beginning of the 1900s. They grow about a third of the country's onions on these fields. This is where Campbell's onion soup comes from. This land is now conserved in a really innovative model that brought together private investors and an NGO and a bunch of grassroots farm groups to create a totally new model for conservation of farmland in my region. And I can still remember, as I look at this image of standing waiting for the bus in the morning with my hair frozen because I had just gotten out of the shower, and hearing the sounds of the mourning doves on the wires above me, right? And hearing the immigrant farm workers walking down the road speaking Spanish. And I think all of us have that memory. So at the risk of stretching this out a little bit, I'd like all of you to take 10 seconds and just think about the first landscape, not necessarily the one you work in now, but the first landscape you connected to, and the one that you think of as that home landscape. And now turn to your neighbor and tell them where that was. That's all good. That's all I got. Okay, folks. That's it, I lost you. I'd like to reclaim my time, please. A point of order, folks. That's it. Thank you very much. You see, land brings us together in really powerful ways. And so in some ways, I think we feel like we're at a crossroads for landscape conservation. But this is a really powerful reminder that land and the landscapes we're from, or that the ones we've chosen to work in, are what brings us together to share. So this is the other landscape that I wanted to mention, and it's actually the same one. So off in the distance, this ridge line here is where I spent my summers in a summer camp focused on the outdoors. It's the Hudson Highlands. It's where the Appalachians, or the Appalachians as we call them up there, cross the Hudson River, which you can see right there. Really remarkable place. And if I felt, and as I began to think about landscapes more deeply, I started to see it as part of this long mega corridor that connects it to the place we're here today, that we're sitting in today. So let me tell you some of the things that are making me optimistic or excited right now. And it's going to be science and planning, really exciting. I'm a conservation biologist, so I'm going to geek out on you for a while. Valuing landscapes and innovative finance, and lastly, joining the climate adaptation and mitigation, more geekery, but joining that agenda. The challenge for landscape conservation, especially from a science perspective, I think, has long been a need for data that on the resources and values we care about at an extent that makes landscape scale planning possible, but at a resolution that makes site interventions and the actual shovels on the ground possible. Right? And bridging that gap, and then again bridging to the national scale, combining landscapes, has really been a challenge for science for a long time. And in particular, as we think about how to stitch together a more national landscape conservation agenda, our ability to supply that agenda with science at that scale that's still actionable has been a challenge. So I'm struck by two comments that were made yesterday. One is also a Mark Anderson. He's a font of quotes, as Mark Anderson is. And he said, the science is exploding. And I think that's completely true. And I'm going to run through a whole bunch of stuff about that. And the other one that I thought was great was, what gets mapped gets saved. And our ability to represent these values on landscapes is really crucial and fundamental to our ability to talk about them and plan for them. And I think we're in a great place from that perspective. So we're going to start from the things that we know we have always worked on, biodiversity, right? We have incredible new biodiversity resources at scale. This is the National Species Data Set. It's got more than a million mapped locations of imperiled species. And I'm not going to go into it, but there is incredible synthesis of this information. It's all online. It's mappable. It's searchable. It's awesome. Right? We have incredible new wall-to-wall land cover, land use data from the American Farmland Trust and Conservation Science Partners. This is an online mapper. A lot of the stuff I'll show you this morning is actually just getting up online, or maybe isn't even online yet, but it's in the next few months or within this year. So this is a brand new data set. It's wall-to-wall, super high resolution. It's harmonized with NRCS's natural resources inventory. It maps agricultural uses and low-density residential for the first time. And here's what it kind of looks like. Here's Richmond, Virginia in 1992. Here's 2012. We can start to see land use change and development patterns at a resolution we've never been able to do, and that's going to allow projects like the Wildlands and Woodlands project to incorporate that data into their threat projections. So for the first time, we're going to be able to use change detection at a national scale, change forecasting and modeling to understand threat priorities and where the edge of the sprawl front is. Almost not in real time, but on an annual basis. We can track those, we can validate those models. Really, really dramatic. Our ability to understand landscape connectivity at intensely high resolution has evolved by orders of magnitude over the last few years, thanks to folks like Brad McRae, who invented CircuitScape and OmniScape. We'll actually, it's worth mentioning, we lost Brad this year. We lost a real groundbreaking researcher on the forefront of connectivity. But this is terrestrial connectivity among all the natural and semi-natural pixels within 50 kilometers of one another. A roving window on a 30-meter pixel across the entire Northwest that allows us to understand where the patterns of wildlife flow and habitat integrity are. At the same time, that same data can be used to actually plan site-scale projects, like the Ivanpah Solar Station here in green. And these are the patterns of connectivity for the desert tortoise. So we can bring this incredible landscape scale right down to the site level and the decision-making moment. AFT and Conservation Science Partners are about to roll out this agricultural lands data set. It differentiates quality of agricultural land, quantifying ag lands by productivity and versatility and resiliency. Go right down to the pixel level, but at a national scale. And that'll be out soon. It's allowing groups like my former employer, Scenic Hudson, to think about individual farms within a 4.5 million acre region. Think about how to connect the farmers of the Hudson Valley to the markets in New York at an incredibly high resolution and target relationships, target outreach to farmers. Other values that we care about, like carbon increasingly, are now available at a national scale, wall to wall. This is the Trust for Public Lands Carbon Mapper, which is online in sort of beta version, soon to be available. It can give us a sense of where the carbon is on a national scale, but can zoom down to a landscape scale and understand where the carbon is and where it isn't, where we want to protect it, where we want to put it back. Understand what the potential of different habitat types are for those restoration interventions. Again, incredibly high resolution, but at a national scale. I think also one really exciting thing is that our understanding that landscapes and ecosystems are dynamic and that our uses of those landscapes are dynamic is deeply informing innovations in our conservation practice. And now our ability to map these dynamics allows us to design flexible conservation solutions that balance use and conservation, that manage for change rather than for persistence, as Bruce Stein likes to point out. Let me show you a few here. So up on the top, you're going to see some range maps of these three birds, grassland birds. You're going to see them at a scale of weeks over the course of a year. This comes from eBird. I think it's awesome. So you can see now the dick sisal is taking over the Great Plains. Savannah sparrow is headed north for the summer. It's coming back down. Rough-legged hawk is coming back from the Arctic and reclaiming the whole Northwest. Yeah. Isn't that amazing? How many of us grew up looking at those range maps in the bird books, and it's like, oh, there's the summer habitat, and there's the, right? We've completely exploded that idea. This is a completely different way of looking at the distribution of biodiversity. And what it's allowing us to do is design really interesting conservation strategies, temporary conservation, where we can farm for rice and then flood the fields and keep them flooded just long enough for those water birds to come north and use it, and then go back into production. We don't have to have a permanent conservation solution there. It's a temporary one and an adorable one. At the scale of years, we can understand. Is this running? Yeah, this is running. And I don't know that it's really showing up there, but this is mesic forage habitat over the course of 3 decades on an annual basis. And it allows us to think about how to target persistent habitats that are high quality, manage grazing and croplands more dynamically, understanding where the landscape priorities are in a much more dynamic way. Oh boy, who lives on the coast here? Hang on to your hats. So this is Surging Seas. It's one of many national sea level rise mappers. This is what happens to the Chesapeake over the course of this century and a bit more, right? We're talking about 26 feet there, so hopefully it's more than this century. But we're able to now think about sea level rise and coastal change and how to adapt our coastlines. The last one I'll talk about here is on the order, so that's the order of centuries. This is the order of millennia. Well, or what used to pass for millennia. Now it's probably centuries. This is a map of the projected range shifts of mammals, birds, and amphibians. Incredible research done, combination of CircuitScape and species range modeling by Josh Lawler and some others. It's allowing us to think about what it takes to sustain a changing landscape over the course of centuries. And if we think about, and then that's allowing folks like Mark Anderson to understand what the most resilient parts of landscapes are and design conservation that's built for the long haul, even in a changing environment. And I'm really pleased to tell you that that science, which is available online in an interactive mapper, the one I just showed you, will be available for the entire country by the end of, Mark, is it next week? Where is he? I think 2019, 2020. Yeah. So we're going to be able to understand where these resilience parts of our entire country are in just a few years. All right, I'm going to speed up here. All of this data is awesome, but it's not actually useful until we can use it as part of a collaborative design process, is what we heard about the entire second half of yesterday. It's about how to take all this information and translate it and use it as a support, as a foundation for the conversation. And the conversation is really crucial. But we've got incredible new tools for systematic conservation planning that allow us to take just about anything we care about. Doesn't matter if it's biodiversity or access to parks or economic development or grazing rights or anything else. We can represent it and solve simultaneously for lots of different objectives. Using tools like MarkSan and Zonation and Vista, it allows us to do things to juggle more thoughts in our digital mind than we've ever been able to juggle. So it's allowing folks in the Peel watershed, part of the Y to Y corridor, to think about, yes, ecological, but also cultural values, energy values, and subsistence and recreation values simultaneously, plan for them. or in New England, the Wildlands and Woodlands Plan again, to also be able to think about what the air quality and carbon and water values of their vision are, solving simultaneously. I think it's really important. And I'm going to exercise my prerogative here, tell you a little bit about a project that I worked on right before joining the foundation, the Hudson Valley Regional Conservation Strategy. And this is an initiative to do a simultaneous optimization plan, a conservation plan for the Hudson Valley, a 4.5 million acre region just north of New York City. We worked with a set of over 24 conservation partners and agencies in a way to effectively achieve multiple goals, including working lands and food, access, biodiversity, connectivity, and climate resilience. Through a consultative process, we identified not just what we were going to conserve, but what success looked like and how much was enough. And these tools are great at making you do that. Really important. What does success look like? Well, for us, it meant we wanted to conserve 50% of all the habitat cores and a third of all the farms in the next 20 years. So we were able to create a solution that solved that. And what you're seeing here is a solution, a consensus map of over 100 good solutions. There's no one solution for a place with 106,000 tax parcels. But we optimized across those 106,000 tax parcels 100 times. Each one was the product of 100 million swaps of parcels. Right? So what we're talking about 10 billion options on the table. And this is the consensus of that. Thank you. I think it's cool. But what's really powerful is that it allows us to look at every tax parcel and understand why it's important, what it contributes to the conservation plan, and then really importantly, we're rerunning it. I don't work there anymore. They're running it 3 times a year. When a parcel stops being an option, it's not available anymore. When we conserve something, we want to know and conserve other places near it. So it's a dynamic process too. All right. But I think one fundamental question for us as a group is ensuring that we have this capacity. We have a high-performing organization or agency who's there for the long haul, who's got the technical chops to bring these tools to the table and stay there and sustain the dialogue with these data forever. As a funder, I hate that. Right? You can't get out of there, right? You can't get out of there, and I think that's really important. I think as a network, this is something we need to grapple with, is how do we create that capacity, keep it on the ground, and keep it working. All right, I'm really going to speed up now. Landscape valuation. Like the science, we have an increasing ability to value landscapes in economic terms at a resolution we've never been able to do. So here's a study that Spencer Meyer did when he was at Yale with the School of Public Health and the Center for Business and Environment. And what it's showing is that access to open space within the 10 towns around New Haven leads to lower hypertension, lower heart disease, lower diabetes, lower obesity rates. It's great. It's worth $37 million in avoided health care costs in those small 10 towns alone. That's got to be worth something. And what we need to do is translate that into money. And I'm going to tell you a few ways that we're doing it. But we're seeing lots of these signals are everywhere. This paper came out last week in Nature, and it showed that upstream watershed tree cover change of 30% has the same value as improved sanitation to rural dwellers. And this is in 23 countries around the world. So for rural dwellers that are difficult to serve with hard infrastructure, landscape-scale conservation actually delivers disease prevention services. Here's another one. On avoided risk, right? We know from a study that came out in August that intact coastal wetland systems saved the New York, New Jersey, Connecticut region $625 million in Hurricane Sandy. That's got to be worth something. It's got to be worth conserving. How do we pay for it ahead of time? And so I think what we're seeing now is just that question. Folks like the Natural Capital Project and Invest are digging down into how to evaluate the value or how to value landscapes for all of these kinds of benefits, ecosystem services that we get. And now we're talking about turning them into innovative finance. So let me start out by saying the innovative finance is still the old finance, right? People still care a heck of a lot and are willing to pay a heck of a lot for the landscapes they care about and call home. In 2016, it doesn't matter if it's a red wave year or a blue wave year, we do great. And I want to thank Ernest for these numbers and for all the work he and his team and the TNC team do on this. 84 out of 104 ballot measures were approved in 2016, right? Supposedly not a great year for environmental concerns, but we racked up $11 billion for the land. And this, just yesterday, we added another $1.5 billion on an off year when we never put ballot measures on the ballot. Right? Doesn't matter. People care no matter where they live, no matter what year it is, and they'll put dollars toward it. But increasingly, it's not about public dollars, it's about private dollars. And this is from Forest Trends globally. We're seeing an almost 50% year-on-year growth of private capital investments in conservation. And it's for sustainable food and fiber mostly, yeah, but it's also habitat conservation and water quality. And so how do we capture that? By all accounts, next year will be another 50% larger, and 50% year on year looks a lot like an exponential growth curve to me. So how do we capture it? One way is green bonds. And green bonds are debt instruments that we issue to get capital. The U.S. green bond market grew domestically from $700 million in 2013 to $12.6 billion last year. So these are debt that we're issuing to do environmental things and pay ourselves back in the savings to health, to water quality, to all those things. But very little is going to land and climate adaptation, the things we're talking about. Mostly it's water. How do we capture more? Well, we're doing really neat things around the world and here on water funds, where we're adding a little fee to the ratepayers to conserve watersheds and restore them. There's 25 water funds active right now and 40 in development around the world. It's driving billions of dollars over the long term toward forest restoration. There's a new one in development out west called the Forest Resilience Bond, and this one's really cool, where we've got investors giving the bond money. They're doing restoration on forests, and then they're getting paid back by the beneficiaries, which in this case are the water utility and the Forest Service. We've got carbon markets that are exploding, and maybe the election results out of Washington portend more carbon dollars in the future that are allowing land trusts like the Down East Lakes Land Trust and TIMOs like Lime Timber to conserve this forest, 22,000 acres in Maine, paid for in part by carbon dollars. On the coasts, buyouts, which are sort of a dirty word, are going to drive billions of dollars into open space conservation on the coastal plain. Come hell or high water, they will. There's almost $1 trillion of residential real estate in the 6-foot contour. And if we think we're not going to buy out some of that, I'm going to sell you some coastal land. All right, my last piece here, and because I do have to wrap up, which has the wonky title of Combined Climate Adaptation and Mitigation, or the Restoration Economy. Nobody knows what either of these things are. But let's think about the forests of West Virginia, which are in the background there. And Mark's resilience agenda. Mark tells us that we're sitting on abandoned farmland in the midst of some of the most resilient forests in the country. Millions of acres of forest that will hold biodiversity in changing climate. But he also shows us with his mapper that there are holes in this forest. And there are opportunities to change that. There's 800,000 or more acres of post-mine land here in West Virginia alone that could have forest and could have carbon and could be generating jobs. And so what we're talking about is using nature, the original carbon capture and storage machine, to put that carbon back on the land and create economic opportunity and make the forest more resilient at the same time. So I just want to share with you a paper that came out just a couple weeks ago, led by the Nature Conservancy, and it looked at 20 pathways, 20 ways that we can put carbon back in the earth using nature around the world. It's mostly breaks down into avoided losses and restoration and improved management. And here is the total possible magnitude of the pathway in billion-ton increments, petagrams, for those of you who really like carbon. Here's what we can do what we have to do in order to stick to the Paris Accord and keep climate change to under 2 degrees. Here's what we can do in dark at less than $10 a ton, which is what's being the price of carbon on the California market. The finding of this study is really important, right? It says that the way we conserve and manage land can contribute more than a third of the carbon mitigation, the emissions reductions needed by 2030 to address the fact that our Paris pledges don't get us to 2 degrees. It helps us close the gap substantially. And the sooner we do it, the more benefit we get. So we cannot succeed in keeping climate change within a safe space without thinking about land and using it as part of the solution set. And that opens up an incredible opportunity. What it means in the U.S. is mostly reforestation, natural forest management, conservation agriculture, and cropland management practices. Does that sound familiar? It sounds like what we talked about all yesterday, right? So the climate agenda now is a landscape conservation agenda. And I think that's an incredible opportunity. In the U.S., the folks at TNC estimate there's 68 million hectares, and multiplied by 2.5, right? Over 100 million acres of forest land that could be reforested, and tens of millions of acres. And if we stick to the long-term strategy laid out by the last administration, we're talking about 13 million acres of avoided loss, 1.7 million acres of additional restoration per year, hundreds of millions of acres of improved management across all of our farmlands. And that means that we're talking about forestry and wood product expansion, conservation strategies that help us avoid losses, and agricultural improvements that help us put carbon back in soils and dollars in farmers' pockets. So if we think back to a place like West Virginia that's desperately seeking economic diversification and is sitting in the most resilient forest region in the East and has 800,000 acres of land with zero carbon in it, aside from the bits of coal that are left in the soil, we have a huge opportunity to touch down in people's lives, solve climate, create resilient landscapes, all at the same time. So it's a lot more than carbon. It touches down on the values we've been discussing throughout the conference. Is about biodiversity and water and air, but also fuel and fiber and feed and food and livelihoods and economies and people's identity here in a place like West Virginia and every landscape that you know. So that's why I'm optimistic. I think we have an incredibly exciting future for landscape conservation. I think it is and will remain the operable unit for conservation action. And the innovations I've just described and a whole lot of others that I would love to talk about give me a lot of hope. And I think also the old is the new, right? The deep social capital that you have collectively built up in the landscapes that you work in are going to allow us to keep innovating and succeeding in the years to come. And I look forward to partnering with all of you in that endeavor. Thanks a lot.